Today, folks, we're stepping into the world of lumber, coal, and railroads to tell the story of a lumber tycoon whose life was as deeply rooted in Appalachia as the forest he harvested. Hello, folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Well, Steve, this one's right up my alley, right in my home county, every bit of this. And when you mention the name W.M. Ritter, it either brings a lot of joy to some people because of the camps, the lumber camps and so forth that were set up, or you start thinking of people that says, man, they took some of the best wood that we had in this county and they took it and they took every bit of it and took it out of here. But it's kind of one of those mixed things, I guess. You know, it was one of those things of where there had to be some kind of industry in Dickinson County at that point. But, you know, it wasn't just Dickinson County. This was a man who ran the largest lumber company in the world. And he picked Dickinson County as, at one point, as kind of like his central operations for everything that was running in Appalachia.
Well, William Ritter, basically his life is the story of what happened to timber in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of hard to believe. I mean, you folks come through here and you see all these forested mountains and beautiful valleys and all that. Back around 1900, it didn't look like that.
No.
All these mountains were bare. Lumber companies came in and just took all that virgin timber out. And what you see now is what's grown in the last 125 years. And William Ritter is one of the folks that was involved in that.
Well, you know, Steve, another thing, too, I can mention about that. I've heard old timers talk about this. And at one time, before the lumber companies came in, like you said, you know, these trees were huge. They were big. Yeah. The forest was so thick. We're talking not thick of, you know, trees, but they said you could almost drive a vehicle through the forest because there was hardly any scrub brush, because these trees were so big and they choked out all the light that reached down to the bottom there of the forest floor. But then when they came in and they started taking all this wood out and everything, that just opened everything up for scrub brush. And some of the trees that we look at and we think, you know, that are old, they're really not that old compared to what some of these trees were. They hadn't been touched until some of these lumber companies came in here, especially around the turn of the century.
Yeah, that's true. And folks, William McClellan Ritter, as Rod said, was part of W.M. Ritter Lumber Company. In fact, he was the founder of that company, and it became one of the largest hardwood lumber companies in the world. His story is one of vision, hard work, and a bit of controversy. And that story stretches from his family home in a small town in Pennsylvania all the way into the mountains of central and southern Appalachia and, Rod, to his fine mansion in Washington, D.C. Now, not only did he cut down trees, he also built railroads, ran coal mines, and served on the War Industries Board during World War I. So, Rod, let's get started from the beginning and tell how Mr. Ritter's journey began.
William McClellan Ritter was born February 19, 1864, in Hughesville, Pennsylvania, in Lycoming County. His upbringing is pretty interesting because it's where his love for the lumber business took root. His family owned a farm in Pennsylvania, and it was there on that family farm that Ritter got his first exposure to the lumber industry. His family had some interesting ties to the American history front, too, you could say. William's mother, Elizabeth Morris Ritter, was part of the Robert Morris family. You know, Robert Morris, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. There's a university named after him in Pennsylvania. So you could say that civic duty as well as business sense were in his blood.
And Rod, here's another fun fact. Ritter's middle name, McClellan, came from none other than George B. McClellan, that famous Union Army general during the Civil War. Turns out his grandfather had actually served with General McClellan, and the McClellan name was given to him in honor of that famous general. Growing up in Pennsylvania, he attended local schools, but instead of pursuing some high-level education or going into politics like other members of his extended family might have done, Ritter stuck with what he knew best, the lumber industry. Before that, though, Ritter took on a variety of roles. For instance, he bought and operated a thresher and even ran a small country hotel.
But by 1890, he was ready to make a name for himself. He packed up and he moved to Mercer County, West Virginia, where he launched his first major logging operation, the Little W.M. Logging Company, and that move would set the stage for his lumber empire. He did well, and soon his business expanded beyond Mercer County, with operations eventually extending into McDowell and Mingo counties in West Virginia, along with Buchanan and Dickinson counties in Virginia, and of course, Pike County, Kentucky. It was in 1894, though, that Ritter made his big move. He established the W.M. Ritter Lumber Company in Welch, West Virginia, which would eventually grow into the largest hardwood lumber company in the world. His company wasn't officially incorporated until 1901, but by then, Ritter had already secured a large footprint across the region.
The scale of Ritter's company was enormous. He owned over 300,000 acres of land across West Virginia, Kentucky, and into Tennessee and the Carolinas. If there was hardwood to be found, William Ritter probably had a hand in cutting it down and shipping it out. Now, he didn't just stick to lumber either. Ritter owned and operated several coal companies like the Red Jacket Coal Company near Matewan, West Virginia. And it wasn't just about harvesting raw materials. Ritter built railroads to transport all that lumber and coal, making his a fully integrated operation. In the end, Ritter wasn't just a lumberman or a coal magnate or a railroad operator. He was simply a businessman who understood that controlling the supply chain from the forest to the marketplace was his key to success. His railroads connected his logging camps, mills, and coal mines to the outside world, helping move materials across Appalachia and on to the rest of America and the world.
But as for many big tycoons of the time, such as Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller, Ritter's career wasn't without its challenges and controversies. One of his most notable involved a serious charge of peonage. Is that right, Steve?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Peonage.
Against his company in 1907. Well, I'm one of these that's unfamiliar with the term, so I'm going to press it and push it along to you and tell you what it is. Peonage refers to forcing someone into involuntary servitude to work off a debt. Okay? And this was a big issue for the Ritter Lumber Company. The Ritter Company hired Italian workers, paid for their travel to America on the condition that the workers repay those travel expenses out of their wages. Well, the conditions these workers faced were, well, frankly, pretty tough. These Italian men were kept under lock and key to prevent them from running away before they paid off their debt to the company. It was a form of forced labor, and it didn't stop there. There were reports of mine guards abusing these workers too, and gosh, the tales. Oh man, now that I know what that means, wow, that's pretty surprising.
Yeah, well, you know, Rod, that kind of treatment happened to catch the attention of some very important people, namely the Italian consulate in the United States, which raised the alarm. An investigation followed, and eventually the company was indicted by a federal grand jury, along with employees William Tolliver, a guard, C.T. Carson, in charge of building a railroad to Ritter property, Lace Stewart, who worked at the Ritter operation in Mortimer, North Carolina, and Elias Hatfield, a quote-unquote detective who arrested a runaway Italian laborer and brought him back to the company. Hatfield was also charged with assaulting the man. Now, Ritter didn't deny the charges. Instead, he paid a relatively small fine to settle the case for the company and for his men and move on. And it is important to note that this wasn't just common with Ritter's company. It was a common practice across the lumber and mining industries at the time all over the United States. But it definitely left a mark on Ritter's reputation, even though his company continued to grow and prosper afterward.
You know, Steve, that kind of reminds me, too, of the stories about the Italians being segregated from the rest of the people in the coal camps and so forth. And, you know, they spoke their language, put them off somewhere else. And you know what's prominent and really stands out with me is in the movie Mate One, when they start bringing some of these Italian workers into the fold to try to talk to them about unionizing there in West Virginia. That was really wild at that point. Well, another major moment in Ritter's life came during World War I. His reputation got him a spot on the War Industries Board. Now, this board was a government body set up to oversee war production, and Ritter was an advisor to Bernard Baruch, who was a key figure in that organization. It shows how influential Ritter had become. Not only was he managing his vast lumber operations, but now he was helping the U.S. government figure out how to efficiently produce materials needed for the war effort. Well, after the war, Ritter just didn't sit back and retire. He kept expanding the business interests and even wrote a book called, simply enough, The Lumber Business. He also served as president of the National Hardwood Lumber Association and treasurer of the National Lumber Manufacturers Association.
Now, one thing that stands out in Ritter's later life is his generosity. In 1924, he made headlines across the nation for gifting $3 million in personal stock to 124 of his employees. That's equivalent to around $53 million today. His actions were so unheard of that President Calvin Coolidge even commended him. Now, despite those peonage charges earlier in his career, Ritter did take care of at least some of his workers in a way that was unusual for the time. Now, folks, let's talk a little bit about Ritter's personal life. He was married twice. His first wife was named Gertrude Adelaide Devine, whom he married in 1896, but they eventually divorced. In 1926, he married Anita Owen Bell in Richmond, Virginia. They didn't have any biological children, but they did have a foster son named Paul D. Ritter.
And as for where Ritter lived, he spent his time in Welch, West Virginia early on. By 1905, he had relocated to Columbus, Ohio, and later on during World War I, he moved to a mansion in Washington, D.C., where he lived for the rest of his life. Now, William Ritter passed away on May 21st, 1952, at the age of 88 in the home that he had created there, that mansion in Washington. He was buried in the family cemetery in Hughesville, Pennsylvania, bringing his life full circle back to where it all began. In 2020, long after his passing, Ritter was inducted into the West Virginia Agriculture and Forestry Hall of Fame. Steve, I don't know about you, but one time I think I was looking through some old Life magazines, and I came across an ad for Ritter Lumber hardwood flooring. And I literally I had to stop because it was geared at the upscale, the rich. That's who had those fine parquet wood floors and everything else that they produced. And, I was kind of shocked. I saw Ritter Lumber Company. You're kidding. They're only from down the road in McClure, which that was just a base of operations. But, there's also some other connections. McClure, a lot of connections in the town of McClure, or I should say the locality of McClure in Dickinson County. So many people have so many stories. I think some of the children of some of the workers back several years ago put together a book, and I'd love to get my hands on it. But I think it's a book about this thick, and it's the history of the Ritter Lumber Company and also stories and tales of things that took place during that time in the Ritter Lumber Company. And I'm not sure or not, but I think at one point, I think my dad may have actually cut some wood or been cutting some wood under his uncle, who he had at the time, Uncle Melvin, and they ran some operations over around Daint. And when they ran those operations, I think they were cutting the lumber down, and then where else was it going? Ritter Lumber Company, or somebody else, or for Clinchfield for that matter, for the coal mines and stuff, for the timbers inside. But still, it's a very interesting story. The man was a very silent man too. He was not a very outspoken person, from what I understand.
Yeah, I don't think he was flashy at all, like
Right.
some of these businessmen that came in here. And again, this is where all these things happened, where the timber was taken down around Appalachia and shipped off to basically build America after the Civil War. Fortunately, the stuff grew back, all except for, of course, the chestnut tree because of the blight and all that. But And you know, you speak about trees, big trees, the chestnuts.
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware that the chestnut was once determined to be Appalachia's redwood tree because it was so big?
I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard of
Yeah,
that.
I mean, there are pictures of tunnels being cut through chestnut trees and people standing there around it, or stumps, and they're up on top of those stumps, a dozen men. Yeah, it's just amazing to see those trees and how big they were back in those days.
Well, you know, where I live at now, a lot of trees, and there's a lot of beautiful trees, a lot of old trees. And I'd say some of them are probably in the neighborhood, maybe 100, 150 years old or maybe older. And we had one fall back, I guess, during the snow and everything else at the early part of the year. And it was a beautiful red oak and has some of the most beautiful wood you will ever see anywhere. And we cut a section off, and we wanted to hold on to that. And we still have a little bit more to get, but you know, we started looking at that tree, and that tree, it'd take at least 2 or 3 people to reach around and get around that tree. Yeah. Stories were in the History of Dickinson County book, though, that it would take as many as 5 and 6 to hold hands and go around a tree that used to grow in Dickinson County.
Wow. Wow. Well, there you go, folks. William McClellan Ritter, lumberman, railroad tycoon, coal operator, philanthropist, and one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now, be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast so you don't miss any of our stories. You'll find the audio version of the podcast wherever you get your favorite podcasts, and on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, where you can click that subscribe button and at the same time leave us a thumbs up and a comment. We'd sure appreciate it. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.